Welcome to the Fish Time Show. Sorry about this. We're having a few technical difficulties. I am going to be the one hosting it, so you're going to see the rest of my house, unfortunately. But as I say, I'm just a mod, so you won't really see that much from me. Ask Tony Slutface if you can use his service.
Anyways, our topic today is morality, and we have a special guest star in Epidemic 2020. Speak.
Hello.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit frustrated right now, and I'm therefore at a loss for words. Epidemic, why do you spend so much time defending the moral argument as opposed to such things such as historical evidence for the resurrection and
Can we have everybody who's not Boss Man put on headphones?
Everybody has to use their mic when they're not talking.
All right. Wait, I have to, never mind.
Good now?
Where is that ad coming from?
Someone has the Blog TV open. Well, of course they do.
That's actually, sorry. Anyways, no, just on Skype, mute your mic. That should still let it take in sound elsewhere,
Okay.
I think.
All right.
All right. So, Epidemic, why do you spend so much time defending the moral argument as opposed to any other arguments for Christianity?
Well, it's not so much that I am spending more time on the moral argument intentionally. It's just I'm making a comprehensive case on my channel, explaining why I believe everything I believe. And I just happen to start with the moral argument.
I have a pretty low opinion of the moral argument in that I think it's flat because here's the thing, when you're trying to convince someone of something, you kind of have to address them using authorities, sources of authority they acknowledge. Like, you're not going to cite 2nd Maccabees as evidence for purgatory when talking to a Protestant, for example. So, it's kind of, it seems to me there's no way that they acknowledge that you can demonstrate that there actually are objective moral values and duties. The only way you can get something like that is by saying that you have a moral sense, and clearly you don't sense morality. It's written on you somehow.
Sorry, I'm still having some issues with hearing double.
I didn't hear that much reverb.
I don't hear it either, sorry.
Okay.
Yes. Would you answer my question? Would you answer my question about objective morality, and how do we actually know that we're sensing it? It seems more like it's written on us, and that's actually what the Bible says, that God wrote it on our hearts, not that He gave us a way to sense it. And as a result, your analogy with it as eyesight, which if that analogy held, your argument would be sound, but it doesn't. So you kind of have to.
I think I see where you're coming from now. There's two types of moral sense theorists. One would be a sense like literally saying that our sense of morality is like our other senses and that it seems empirical, which is not my position. And then the other one which I do subscribe to, is that we just have innate knowledge of morality. That's what we mean by talking about our moral sense. So I don't think I need to make it exactly like eyesight in order for us to be rational for believing.
Hey,
But I
Epic.
do think that eyesight and morality are justified in the same way, ultimately.
Hey, Epidemic. Just for the audience, can you clarify what you mean by those?
By
By the two.
what is it?
By innate moral knowledge and the other way of looking at morality.
Okay. So one way would be to think of it as a sense, like our sense of taste or touch or sight, and the other way would just be to think of it like in Pinocchio, how they have Jiminy Cricket. It would literally be your conscience. It would be that that you're hardwired in such a way that some moral claims are just obviously true. So I subscribe to the latter group.
Okay.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I was going to be the devil advocate this whole show, and now you've convinced me of the moral argument again.
Man, this show is sucking.
Hey.
Back and forth.
Okay.
Does anybody in here disagree with the moral argument?
It depends on how you formulate it, because like to me, like certain variations of the moral argument tend to get under my skin. Like for example, the popular version, like something like, I'll give you Spedifang X for example. I don't know if you saw my video on this topic, Epidemic, but I did talk about how many evangelicals who do support the moral argument tend to take a version of it and just like make it so unnuanced and unsophisticated. So how would you respond? How would you say? No, let me rephrase that. Would you argue that certain versions of the moral argument are better than other variations of it?
Most definitely. And it seems that not all people who critique it or support it actually understand what it's supposed to be saying. I think you come across that with pretty much any argument.
Mm-hmm.
It usually gets portrayed as something like atheists can't be moral. And if that's what the moral argument was actually arguing, then I wouldn't accept it because that seems pretty absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And other people argue that tend to think that the moral argument somehow saying that morality means something like never murder, or never kill people, or never lie, or something like that. So I think it's really the misunderstandings that end up preventing people from accepting it.
Okay, so how would you personally formulate the argument? Like, give us like a basic rudimentary version of the argument.
All right, I'll try and simplify it in the way it's typically explained. But it basically just says that we recognize objective morality exists, and that theism offers a way to explain this, and that naturalism doesn't. So theism would be a better explanation of reality than naturalism.
Okay.
Okay, I was saying, chat, can we just do a handout next if you want to be just, does anyone get if that's okay, Jacob?
What's that? That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, just that everyone gets
I have my own thoughts, but I'll let everyone else speak too. So you can come back to me.
Who wants to go next? Anyone? No. Alright, you can go, Jacob, sorry. I just
Hold on.
So
Okay.
that everyone gets that's all.
Okay, hold on a second. So you would argue that theism provides a better foundation for morality, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so how would you respond to, say, someone trying to argue for objective morality outside of a theistic framework?
I'd have to hear their actual foundation.
Like,
usually what happens.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, let me give you an example. Like, there's, for example, like a while ago, and I'll just give you the short version of this article. It's basically The Case for Objective Morality by Francois Tremblay. And the short version is basically, the unit of ethics is values. Values are things that one must work to gain or keep. A simple example of that is nutrition. These values are shorthanded ways of expressing moral principles. Example, we need to eat because otherwise we die, and moral principles are shorthanded way of expressing scientific or social facts, such as the facts about metabolism. The basis of ethics is causality. Everything has consequences, and so do actions. Actions have consequences, and our role is to find these consequences and act accordingly. By evaluating what values are being affected by a given action in its context, we can express a sound moral judgment on that action. This was a good thing to do, this was a bad thing to do, etc., etc., etc. This is true regardless of your actual moral system. We all have values, implicity or explicity. The real argument is about those scientific and social facts and what values they entail. There cannot be any argument on whether or not there are objective moral principles. It's a discussion about as ridiculous as asking whether the earth exists. We all need to act to survive. So basically he's trying to argue that theism itself, objective morality can exist outside of theism in that sense. How would you respond to what I just said?
I think what he's really explaining is only half of the story. So morality shouldn't be just about telling us how we should achieve a specific goal, but about which goals we ought to value in the first place. And I would agree with that author that science can tell you how to achieve your specific goals. But science doesn't tell you whether or not the goal of, say, causing harm or the goal of preventing harm is one that ought to be achieved, given your personal desires. It could be either one.
Okay.
Okay, Aaron K.
Yeah, going back to your formulation of the argument, I can already foresee a possible objection on the part of the skeptic. Basically, he said that objective morality, or your version, that you would hold the best of formulations, or however you put it, is objective morality exists, and theism has explained it, or has an explanation for why objective morality exists, whereas naturalism doesn't, then theism pretty much wins by default, or something like that. So I can already see, like, everyone knows that my expertise is in history, but not saying that I necessarily agree with this objection, but I can already see a skeptic, saying something like, well, that's just a God of the gaps argument, because you're just saying that just because the theistic side has a certain explanation automatically makes it right. So, and that's not a valid approach. So how would you respond to that argument?
Right, I'm glad you brought that one up. So the argument is not just saying that theism has a better approach than naturalism currently has. It's saying that naturalistic approaches fail to account for objective morality, even in principle. So not only do the current methods fail, but they fail in principle. So it's not based upon what we don't know. I'm not making an argument for ignorance here. I'm making a claim based upon what we do know. And what we do know is that naturalism can't account for it.
Okay, Jacob.
Okay, this is more of related to objective morality. Like, for me personally, and I know it's not 100% related to the moral argument, but it is somewhat related. Like, on your channel, you make a lot of arguments for objective morality, and then argue that, like, I do think you argue it very well, but one thing I've always objected to, like, the whole concept of objective morality is that I don't disagree with the concept. What I do have an objection to is that how would you understand, like, what is objective about morality if, like, for example, certain cases where it does become more complicated? How would you explain that objection?
Okay, this is another thing that gets confused a lot. There's actually three fields of morality that you can study in, like, a philosophy classroom. And the one I talk about all the time is normative ethics, which asks questions like, is there such a thing as right or wrong? And what you just mentioned is applied ethics, which goes to figuring out the answers to specific moral dilemmas. And what I think is really important, a lot of people, their inability to solve certain moral dilemmas leads them to conclude that there is no such thing as normative ethics, and that there is no right answers to moral questions. And I would say that even if we have a really hard time or difficulty solving complex moral dilemmas, that shouldn't affect whether or not we believe that a right answer exists. that's a question about whether or not we can know the right answer given the information we have.
Okay, so let me give you an example, and let me see if you can be able to answer it. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay, let's just use the classic murder argument. Okay, all murder is wrong. Like, for example, you go into your house and you murder your spouse. Okay, let's just assume that. However, you murder your spouse who also wronged you at the same time. Does that make sense? So, like, it's
So is it
like
killing an innocent person versus
No.
killing somebody who...
you killing your spouse who also did something wrong to you. For example, like, you killed your spouse because your spouse killed your son. It's just random example. Like, how would you respond to something like that?
I think, so like killing a stranger killing someone versus killing someone out of revenge.
Right.
Well, I think that whether or not, you see, you could have the same answer for both. You could say that killing for revenge is wrong and killing just without a good reason is wrong. But what's important to notice is that those are two different moral questions entirely. Like whether or not I can determine that killing someone without a good reason is immoral or moral, that doesn't tell me whether or not killing someone out of revenge is moral or immoral.
Okay, so
they should be treated as two separate moral facts, and we're trying to figure out the answer to each of them.
It's fishing time, followed by RK.
Yeah. Firstly, I feel like what I wildly misunderstood moral dilemma because my understanding was he was asking you if it's acceptable to kill your spouse whom you love because your spouse killed your child whom you love. And I also think what he was trying to do is more so ask if revenge is a good reason. So I mean, in your opinion, is it acceptable to kill for revenge, or does it? To me, it feels more as if you ought to report them to the authorities.
Yeah, given our society and the availability of jails and law enforcement that can handle disputes with more certainty and more resources than we can, I would not think that killing someone out of revenge, like vigilante-style justice, would be acceptable.
Okay, let me use it.
Okay, and then I'll let you go, Jacobs. Okay.
If you guys are, like, if this discussion is still going on, I'll wait, but I wanted to pose a new topic, so Jacob can go if he still wants to talk about this.
I do have one more objection.
Okay, I'll let Jacob go, then I'll let RK go, okay.
Okay, like, related to the topic of revenge, let's change it up a little bit. Like, you would argue that killing for revenge is wrong then. Okay, correct.
Well, I've argued vigilante justice is wrong.
Okay,
in our society, given that we have other alternatives that are less harmful.
So you would argue that revenge is not necessarily wrong, but really depends on the context. So, like, for example, let's just use 9/11 as an example. Like terrorists from the Middle East, they flew planes into our buildings and they attacked the World Trade Center. And then we decide to go to war to stop them. But that would be the same as revenge. Would it be moral to do so in the context of war, or really the context of individual situations?
Okay. Before I answer that, I just want to make it clear that these are my thoughts about morality, and I am entirely subject to being incorrect in some of my assessments. That doesn't reflect upon whether or not objective morality exists. That just reflects on my own ability to think about these things clearly.
Okay.
But in principle, I don't see anything wrong with retribution or with trying to prevent further crime, which would be what punishment, the goal of punishment would be either to seek justice, to punish someone for what they've done, or to prevent them from causing further harm. So while I don't see anything wrong with that in principle, I think most instances we see that we would call revenge would be immoral.
Mhm. So So like the incident of going after the 9/11 terrorists would be an incident of revenge, but it wouldn't be on the same level as like killing your spouse for killing your child, basically.
Right. Yeah, each situation, when you change it, it makes it more complex of a moral thing to solve. And applied ethics is a very tricky, intricate subject.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, the theories that offer the simple answers to those kind of questions are often the ones that are, I guess, the more you think about it, the less black and white morality becomes.
Mhm.
Bishop Calder. Sorry, Aaron K can go first. I realize it's his turn.
Yeah, I was going to say, okay, please. And then if you all go next, because I've settled the foot hand.
Okay, I saw this request in your re-uploaded video epidemic is that someone wanted you, I believe, to discuss the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, for those in the blog TV that don't know what that is, I believe I'm summarizing it correctly. Basically, the Euthyphro dilemma is a question with two options. Is what is moral because it's commanded by God, or are things, or is what is commanded by God moral because it is moral? Or, sorry, I'm not reiterating this correctly. Epidemic can correct this, but this Euthyphro dilemma often comes up in discussions of morality in the Bible. For example, the supposed atrocities committed by the Israelites. So I'll hear Epidemic discuss the problems with this dilemma, if you don't mind.
Okay, so the Euthyphro dilemma basically just asks, does God command something because it's moral, or is it moral because God commands it? Now, the essence of this dilemma is to ask, is morality just arbitrarily determined by whatever God decides to command, or is it something completely external to God, so we don't need God in the equation at all? And I, like most Christians I know, would say the answer is neither. That morality is not dependent upon whatever God just chooses, and that he doesn't have to appeal to any external standard either. And as long as there's a third option there that's even logically possible, then the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma. So what I would ultimately argue that the third possibility could be was that morality would be based upon God's nature, and God's commands would merely reflect his nature. And by nature, I mean his essential properties. So I basically,
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll let you finish, sir.
That I would say, Epidemic, you're making a small mistake there. I do think Euthyphro is a true dichotomy, and I think your answer falls under the second category. You're saying that morality is coming from a source besides God's commandments, and that he is commanding these things because it's moral, but at the same time, you are having your cake too, as well as eating it, because you know because you're still having God as the source of morality. So, but you are ultimately choosing the second option as the source of God's commands. You're saying he commands them because he understands and is aware that they reflect his essential properties and therefore are moral, is what I would say. And also, if you want to call into the Fish of Time show, please send a Skype invite to Fish of Time, all one word, all lowercase, and we will accept your contact request and drag you in. Please do not appear offline, and please do not call the show. Please do not call us. We will call you.
I think your assessment there is actually pretty fair. From my experience, when people are raising the Euthyphro dilemma, what they mean by that second horn of the dilemma is morality external to God? And if you want to argue that that God commands something because it's immoral, but that it's not external to him, then I would have no problem with that.
Yeah, that is what I would have to argue.
Okay, Jacob, and then Phil, if you could bring Cody Key Pirate in. So Jacob, you go.
Okay.
We'll see if we can. Okay.
Okay, this is related to divine command theory, because like when you just talked about the youthful dilemma, it also reminded me of divine command theory, and I don't know if you hold to that theory, but I noticed that many skeptics, when you talk about the youthful dilemma, it also brings up their objections to divine command theory. So like, let's just for the sake of argument that your response to the youthful dilemma is true. How would that imply divine command theory? And if you do support divine command theory, how would you formulate it?
I do support divine command theory, but that theory has to be like the worst named theory of all time, because the way it makes it sound, even in its title, is that morality is determined by whatever God commands. But in reality, that's just a subset of divine command theory that only a very small minority of Christians or divine command theorists nowadays actually hold to. So, although in almost all the textbooks, divine command theory or the places you read about it, divine command theory is critiqued for being the idea that God just commands whatever's moral and he gets to choose. That's actually a theory known as voluntarism, and that's not something that I subscribe to. And I actually don't know of any philosophers that do currently subscribe to it.
So you do hold to a divine command theory, but you hold to it in a specific way, basically.
Right. I almost don't like to use the term because it's just very poorly named and almost always leads to people misunderstanding what I'm trying to say.
What word would you describe it for then?
I actually don't have a good term for it, but I just explain my position rather than trying to assign a name to it. I would say that God has, by necessity, by his very essential nature, has a set of characteristics which we recognize as the standard of morality, and that whatever he commands is going to reflect that standard. So his command, he's never going to command something like raping people for fun, because that goes against his very character. So
okay, so
all right, he could command and continue to be moral.
Okay, let me play. Do you mind if I play devil's advocate?
Go for it.
Okay, let's suppose that all that is true. Let's just suppose that. How would that explain the atrocities in the Old Testament, like when God ordered the genocide of the Midianites, the Canaanites, and the Amalekites?
Okay. So,
again, keep in mind I'm playing devil's advocate, so.
Right. The confusion here is that people often think of morality in terms of just actions. Like, for example, it'd be pretty easy to say genocide is wrong, even though that's a blanket statement. And some people do the same thing with other scenarios, like saying killing is wrong or lying is wrong. And in reality, the only way to determine if something's wrong is to know not only the action, but the action, the intention, and possibly even the actual consequences that come from it. So the question is not to say, is killing people wrong or is genocide wrong? It's to say, what were the intentions of that command and what were the actual consequences of that command? And if you can't argue that there are level of intentions or malevolent consequences, then you can't actually say it's immoral. That was the kind of argument from ignorance.
Okay. Up until have you started out Koiki Pirate yet? Up until
Bobby Turtle.
have you fallen back asleep yet? You see, we're trying to organize a color and up until do you want Deacon to bring him in? Hello?
Bobby Turtle.
Is there a caller?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Richard.
Koiki Pirate.
I'll get it. I'll bring him in.
Okay, we've got our first caller, Koiki Pirate. When he comes in. We'll get to that in a minute.
There we go. Goki!
Okay, what's up? Keith Parrott, what's your question, statement, or just query?
Well, what I was going to get at is that ultimately, if we're going to be discussing morality, the issue is, especially if we're going to talk if there's such a thing as an objective morality, is morality something prescriptive or is it something descriptive? For example, I can say these are the rules for a Monopoly game, and I'm just describing the rules for the Monopoly game. That's objective because it's just a description. If we're playing, that doesn't necessarily mean that we ought to follow those rules. Those are just the rules as they are. Whereas if it's prescriptive, that's to say that we ought to do something. Likewise, if we're going to say that morality is objective, are we defining morality as, the rules that God made into the universe? Or are we going to, we just, those are the rules that we can choose to obey or disobey? Or are we going to say that these are the rules, we ought to follow them? Because the only way you can get something prescriptive requires some sort of value being entered into this. Like, I want to go to heaven, therefore I ought to follow these commandments. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. All discussions about the normative ethics are prescriptive. So any of your famous normative theories are going to be talking about not merely descriptions, but also prescriptions. Not merely what we should do what we must do to achieve our goal, but that we should have certain goals.
Okay, so how would that possibly be objective?
Because it's not dependent upon my preferences, or it's not a product of my mind. When I say that I ought not rape people, like even if I wanted to rape people, I recognize that I shouldn't do so. I ought to hold that goal regardless of whatever personal goals I have.
But what's the basis for that?
Well, we can look at our conscience and just realize that our conscience is telling us a fact about reality, that I ought not rape people for fun. And if my conscience is not mistaken, then there exists an objective moral fact that I ought not rape people for fun.
Well, that just states that our brains are designed that we can function in a community without raping one another.
You can boil anything down to saying this is the way our mind tells us, and you could argue that faculty, that knowledge is just an illusion, or it's mistaken in some way. But until we have reason to think that's actually the case, then we have reason to think objective morality actually exists.
But that's not really a case. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, epidemic, the way I usually do it is that you type in if you want to respond to the caller. Usually what I do is that I throw it around about 3 people, then I point back to the caller. I mean, does anyone else have anything to contribute, or is it alright if we just let epidemic and Chloe compare it as well? Alright, sorry, it's just that's the way I usually do it. Sorry, epidemic, I didn't mean to stop you full floor.
So did you have anything else that you were objecting to?
Well, in terms of we must accept that objective morality exists until we have evidence to say that it's necessarily, this cognitive faculty is an illusion. I mean, really, I don't see a very strong case either way, so why do I have to adopt one or the other position? If there's another possibility, that's reason enough to just adopt the null hypothesis there.
The other, okay, but if I may please,
probably till type on, remember, epidemic later on of God. Sorry. Probably till, and then if everything was responsible for that, he made it. So.
You want to go first, Puppy?
yeah, what you just said, please, I hope I'm misunderstanding you here. Did you just say that the fact that there's an alternative option means that you should always accept that alternative option? Doesn't that lead to hopeless self-contradiction? And I mean, and especially regarding morality, I mean, just as the default position is that our logical faculties and our senses are accurate until we have a reason to believe otherwise. The default position is that what we sense about morality, or what we are innately aware of about morality, is accurate until we have reason to believe otherwise.
But in terms of what allows us to socially interact and, not commit these malicious atrocities, it's demonstrable. Certain animals have it, certain animals don't. You can actually see that in the brain.
Okay. Right. Epidemic. Do you want to go next time, or next? All right. Epidemic.
All right, so I would respond very similar to the way Puppy Turtle did here. I would say that just because there's an alternative, like just because it's possible that the Matrix is true, doesn't mean that it's equally probable that the Matrix is true as to say that reality is true. Whatever the illusion is, if you're going to argue something is not the way it appears to be, then you have to give some sort of supporting reason to think it's actually the case. The default would be to think reality is the way it appears. And to that last point you made, I think that's where we get to something like the genetic fallacy. Just because something is socially beneficial or something of that nature, it doesn't really matter why the knowledge came to be. It matters whether or not the knowledge is true or false. And observing how the knowledge came to be doesn't tell you whether or not the knowledge is true or false.
Well, this is the thing. I'm just trying to see how it follows that because we have this sense of it being right, means that it necessarily is right. I mean, I don't see the chain of logic. It's clear that it's really just an accident of biology. Well, not an accident. There is an evolutionary benefit, but oh no, I just heard my own echo. What was that? I mean, in terms of, are they equally probable? Well, the question, I'm thinking of the question, is this the Matrix or not? It's out of pragmatic value that I go through life assuming this isn't the Matrix. I really can't do anything with the hypothesis that this isn't real. Whereas, I live my life, and assuming my life is real, it definitely affects my well-being or suffering. In terms of whether morality is objective external to my mind, or whether it's something, that is created by my brain, I can actually do something with that hypothesis that, what I perceive as morality is just typical of any social mammal. I can come to a greater understanding of, neurological development and whatnot. I really don't see what can be gained by saying morality is objective.
When I claim that the world,
Sorry.
Yeah. When I claim that the world exists, and the Matrix is not real, I'm not really making that basis on an idea of what's pragmatic. I actually believe that the existence of the real world is more probable than the existence of the Matrix. And I'm not arguing that objective morality exists in the sense that I'm absolutely certain. I'm arguing that I have, with the same certainty that I believe the external world exists, I also have reason to believe objective morality exists. And that's more than enough certainty for me.
What's the certainty based on?
That if we have innate knowledge of something being true and no reason to think that knowledge is an illusion, that reality is the way it appears to be.
Okay, Puppy Turtle.
Yeah, actually completely forgot what I was going to say. It was, firstly, I doubt snails know about the law of non-contradiction. So just like there are animals that don't know about morality, like, for example, piranhas, who, despite the plans of some, do eat each other. There's footage of it all over the internet. Just because they don't have knowledge of you ought not cannibalize. In fact, some people seem not to have knowledge of you ought not cannibalize. That doesn't actually that doesn't actually seem to affect anything if some animals don't know it and we do. And if animals do know it, if animals do know it, that may help the case for objective morality, but them not knowing it doesn't hurt it beyond depriving it of that help.
Okay. To this I have a question. Other than the fact that I come from a certain position, how would I know that what I believe to be moral, or what I believe to be objectively moral, if I'm going with this line of thought, is what is truly objectively moral, as opposed to that of some other organism or human who believes to be objectively permissible or moral?
Simply because, well, first off, we don't know that other animals don't have knowledge of objective morality. Of objective morality. So, I mean, even those that don't behave as if they do, we don't know if they do.
Okay.
Epidemic, you're going to...
Yeah.
It's okay, then it's epidemic. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to briefly talk about the analogy that Thunderfoot provided regarding, he asked why piranhas in the feeding spree don't kill each other. As Veritas48, a great YouTuber, until he closed his account, pointed out, is that that's really comparing apples to oranges, because piranhas are not capable, as far as we know, of developing moral or belief about God. So I really don't think that this analogy is valid in any case. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, well, in terms of cannibalism, do I have to speculate on the possibility that on some level this individual knows, a human being, knows that it is wrong to eat other people when this culture seems to thrive on it?
Okay, Epidemic 2020.
That question actually is really related to the one you asked right before that. When we come to knowledge of morality, it's not knowledge of moral conclusions. Our moral conclusions can be wrong. That's what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about applied ethics. It's much more complicated. Our conscience tells us that normative ethics exist, that there are right and wrong answers to moral questions. That doesn't mean that we're always going to come to the right answers. Like, for example, whether you think cannibalism is right or wrong is not going to be something that you know intuitively. It's going to be, intuitions are going to be related, but it's also going to deal with your reason, your information about reality. And if I have scientific misinformation telling me that my enemies are subhuman or that they're less valuable than me for some reason, then I might be able to rationalize eating them. But that doesn't, if that's scientific misinformation at play, then that doesn't mean that my intuitions are what's flawed.
I mean, exo-cannibalism is actually the minority when it comes to cannibalism. Most of the time, it's individuals who have already passed away. It's not any kind of misinformation. It's just generally seen as the consensus that this is right and this is wrong, which is the case for a lot of moral norms. Now, to say that we can't necessarily know what is right or what is wrong, but there is a right or is a wrong, isn't that pretty much the same thing as saying we're essentially living in the Matrix, that there's something we can't quite get to?
I'm not saying that we can't get to it. I'm saying that it's not all, you can't get to it just by intuition. That it requires some more thought than intuition is able to provide alone. You have to use reason as well, and reason is subtle.
Okay, so by reason you mean come to some kind of understanding that something is right and something is wrong. And if they do not come to the correct conclusions, it necessarily means that their reason is flawed, or?
It means that reason is, like, different societies have different information. Whether or not you believe witches exist is going to believe whether or not you think it's moral to burn witches. So I'm arguing that having misinformation is going to be like a dirty lens that's going to skew your intuitions. They're going to skew your moral conclusions, basically.
And so how can we come to any conclusion that there are any correct ones if we all essentially have this kind of, at least initial, dirty lens.
Even if I can't realize which actions are going to cause harm in the long run, I can realize that causing harm itself is something that generally ought to be avoided. And as to if I can't determine whether or not certain actions cause harm, that doesn't undermine the claim that causing harm is generally wrong.
And I typed 10. So in addition, I would say that, you know, you can demonstrate, you can take out of the depths of Africa, you can take the cannibalistic tribe and the tribe that they're feeding off of, and you can notice that the cannibalistic tribe is no more different from the other tribe, that those two tribes are only as different from each other as any two given tribes are in the area, and they're about the same difference and they are roughly the same difference from us. And you also know about the genetic bucket chain. Mathematics can actually give you information, because, you know, once you get to about 2,500 years ago, everybody that lived at that time is either the ancestor of everybody alive today or nobody alive today. So that information, which is demonstrable, because it's demonstrable, we can see it's the correct information, and therefore we can trust it to give us moral knowledge.
I definitely understand your case about exocannibalism, that it would be based on some kind of scientific misconception. But that doesn't really constitute the majority of cannibalism. I'd say, at least from what I've read and what I understand about anthropology, that necrocannibalism is the most common, and endocannibalism is also considerably more common than exocannibalism. So what about in regards to people who sincerely believe that it is to do the people be prepared to die for the food of the rest of this tribe, or when an individual dies, you know, it is perfectly acceptable to feast on their body?
Is there any reason it ought not be? I mean,
So, Mr. Todd, you want to go next? Sorry.
I don't necessarily come to the conclusion that there is something objectively wrong with in a situation where you are struggling for food, especially with eating someone who's already passed away. I don't necessarily come to the moral conclusion that that's wrong. In fact, for the situation of poverty those tribes are in, I actually don't come to that conclusion.
Well, this is actually something, because I absolutely agree with you when I'm just talking about, you know, pure reason why I think something is right and wrong. But if you're going to argue that some kind of objective morality that we are intuitively conscious of, even if we don't know the specifics of it, I mean, there are people who have never heard the word cannibalism in their life. And when they hear of that scenario of eating a dead person, they are intrinsically appalled to it and understand it to be wrong. This is not because I mean, I don't talk about cannibalism with all my friends, but there have been plenty of instances where cannibalism comes into the conversation, and these individuals who have never given any thought before just seem to intrinsically believe it is wrong.
Okay, anyone go next? Epidemic.
All right, so there's a couple things here. One would just be to point out that cannibalism, as you're mentioning it, whether it's just okay to eat a dead person or eat a dead person if you're starving, or whatever your reasons, is that that's not a single moral dilemma, that's a host of moral dilemmas. Like each different reason why you would eat a person constitutes its own new potential moral fact. And a lot of times you're still going to have reason be one of those determining factors, such as what you view a person as. Certain cultures would have a problem eating a person because they think it would cause something else bad to happen, or they would believe eating a person allows you to steal their strength or something like that. Or even the cultures that are just starving are doing it just so they can sustain themselves. Your beliefs matter and the situations matter, but ultimately this entire discussion is a debate about a specific moral conclusion. It's a debate within applied ethics. And regardless of what conclusion you come to, even if you come to the conclusion that it's unknowable, it's not going to undermine the moral argument, which deals with the belief that normative ethics exist. No matter what confusions you have about applied ethics, it just isn't going to refute normative ethics as a whole.
And we're talking about normative ethics, you mean there is a right and wrong because we intuitively understand there to be a wrong, that there is a right and wrong. Am I understanding clearly?
Right. You're going to bring in not only misinformation and information, but you're going to bring in cultural perspectives, what you've been raised as, your societal norms and stuff. Those are all going to, even your personal views are going to, to some extent, lead you to rationalize certain behaviors. You have a lot of things which can muddy your moral lens, so to speak. It's going to make you come to erroneous moral conclusions or uncertain moral conclusions or even just different moral conclusions from other people. And at no point does any of that, unless you're arguing that we have reason to doubt our intuitions. Merely doubting that we come to the same moral conclusions isn't going to do away with normative ethics.
Okay, like this whole thing about there's no reason to doubt our intuitions. This is just, if it's just an accident of birth that we have, these intuitions as opposed to a completely different mindset with a completely different brain, that our brain is, we just have to immediately assume it's best brain in the animal kingdom. Is that really any different from assuming that my nationality is the best nationality just because you don't have a reason to assume otherwise?
No, I don't think so. Being born with something like, you could argue the same thing by saying, we're just hardwired to have eyesight, therefore, we shouldn't trust what we see, because eyesight is just a natural product of our genetics. But to me, that's not going to be any more persuasive than saying morality is just a byproduct of our brain.
Well, this is the thing. There are benefits to assuming that our eyesight is in fact reliable, and there aren't very many benefits at all to assume that that our eyesight, is completely unreliable. Whereas when it comes to whether or not morality is objective or not, I really don't see any clear benefit to accepting, as true that morality is necessarily objective, as opposed to just assuming that it is a matter of perspective and reason and such.
I think I disagree for the same reasons I mentioned earlier.
Hey, sorry, internet's on the fritz. I'm gonna have to bail because you've been cutting out and stuff. But I hope everyone has a nice day. This was a nice discussion.
All right, have a good one.
Thank you very much, Koki Pirate. Thank you very much.
Oh, that one last thing, Koki Pirate. We love you.
Okay, so if anyone else wants to call in, please call us on Fishing Time. That's all lowercase, one word, on Skype. We'll call you. Please don't. Please appear online. I will call you. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about something with you, Academic, if that's okay. If anyone else doesn't mind. Does everyone else mind? Sure. Alright, let's put it then.
I would like to talk, now that we've spoken of cannibalism and murder and these things, I would now like to talk about something that we appear to have moral knowledge of the wrongness of, despite the fact that it causes no identifiable harm whatsoever. And that would be the news story that Jacob showed us regarding the grandmother who is having a new child with her grandson, he was in his I think 20s or 30s.
Late 20s.
I mean, what do you think of that epidemic? We seem to have innate knowledge of that being wrong, and yet it causes no identifiable harm.
Incest? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Has no identifiable harm? Oh, well, it does have identifiable harm. genetically speaking, the closer you are related to somebody, the more of the genes you share. And it's let's say that I have a gene that has a 1/4 chance of killing me. But it's only going to be activated if I come across somebody who also has this gene that only 1/4 of the population has. So my odds aren't that terrible of getting it because there's only a 1/4 chance that I have it, and there's only a 1/4 chance somebody else has it. Well, if they're related to me, then there's a much higher, and I have it, then there's also an incredibly high chance that they have it. So it definitely increases your odds of having genetic defects and causing harm to whatever your future offspring are.
Okay, Jacob.
Okay, I wanted to bring up like I wanted to add something to that also, is that one thing I had a question about is that with incest, like most cultures condemn it, but what would you say to someone that says that incest is not inherently wrong? Like, what would your reasons be? Because, like,
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I think we don't have intuitions about incest being wrong, but we have a natural aversion to incest being wrong because it naturally tends to cause harm.
Mhm.
And so we're leery of that scenario because it causes harm.
Mhm.
So while there may not be anything technically wrong with it, that because it tends to cause harm, we would tend to view it as immoral.
Okay. Like, let me just play devil's advocate again. Like, usually when we're arguing against incest as Christians, many skeptics would try to bring up the fact that the idea of incest in the Old Testament, and all that stuff. How would you respond to that?
Well, once again, assuming that you interpret the Bible in such a way that there has to be incest, then, like, if there were only 2 humans on the earth, it would be a very different moral question as to say whether or not that I just happen to be attracted to my sister and want to reproduce.
Mhm.
So the question of we need to save the species and repopulate with this limited number versus, I just want to have incest because that looks like fun to me. Those are 2 completely different moral questions. And I would probably argue that they have different moral conclusions, that one could be justified. Repopulating the earth would not necessarily be immoral, where just reproducing with your sister would cause unnecessary harm.
Mhm. Right.
I'll ask the question I'll play it a bit more delicately than he does, which is a brother and sister have sex with protection. Who else does that have?
That still seems quite aversive to me, but I'm not sure if there is a reason to think that it is actually wrong. But y'all can definitely feel free to disagree. I haven't really contemplated this issue prior to this discussion. I'm an only child, so I don't have to worry about such things.
Okay, Phil?
Yeah, incest is a bad example, but what about contraception? I think this is where religion becomes extremely relevant to morality, because if we agree that there's a God, then it seems to me, if we agree that there's a God, that there's a sense in which things like things like a contraception would be. There's a way in which they could be forcing your will upon something that God created this world to. He created this world with a certain natural order, and to violate that would almost be like enforcing your will upon God in a certain way. I know that's the argument that Roman Catholics make on contraception. Whereas if there is no God, then there's literally no problem with anything sexual, so long as it doesn't cause any kind of harm. But what about things like homosexuality and and contraception, where the only possible thing, there's no conceivable harm they could cause, and yet we seem to realize that they're wrong for reasons like that, which you could argue aren't even real reasons that it's something wrong.
Okay, Epidemic.
As far as contraception goes, I personally don't see anything wrong with it. But if you were going to argue that it goes against God's plan, that's why it's wrong. I think it would be just as easy to have an understanding of God where He plans that humans are going to come up with that. Like, for example, you could equally argue that building a skyscraper is against God's plan because God didn't build that into God didn't give us the knowledge of that right away. I don't think that coming up with these new inventions or a different way of doing something is necessarily thwarting God's plan, or that God's plan is so small that it can't incorporate our actions into it.
What of homosexuality? That doesn't fiddle with God's plan because it has no long-term consequences. There's no possible harm it causes, no possible anything, and yet, I mean, that's the only thing. That's the only moral I know of in Christianity or in anything that seems to be just a divine command.
Okay, Jacob.
In regards to the topic of homosexuality, I think this is one of those issues where this is more of a religious topic than a philosophical topic regarding morality, because we have to understand that when it comes to homosexuality, whether or not it's a sin or not, that's a religious question within Christianity. That's not a question within the topic of ethics, in my opinion. So, say, if you're going to argue that homosexuality is wrong, then you're basically making a religious argument, not necessarily a philosophical argument, at least in my opinion.
I don't have anything too profound to say on this topic. I tend to stay away from things that I can't really relate to as much, or that I don't personally struggle with. But I would like to just point out, it's kind of interesting, that homosexuality is one of the only things one of the only instances, there are a couple other examples out there, but typically our empathy and our sense of morality are aligned, and for me at least, that's one where that alignment is not really there. Like, it's very easy for me to empathize with people who would struggle with homosexuality, and it tends to be that empathy and intuition go hand in hand. Just doesn't seem to in that case.
Okay, we have another caller complete rationality wants to call in. Just trying to give you...
Can I say something first?
Go on.
I think the issue is, I can empathize with someone who struggles with homosexuality, in that I have empathy for their plight and their struggles not to do something that's wrong. And I can even have empathy for those examples, but I don't feel like there's any reason empathy and intuition necessarily ought to be aligned. You can have empathy for a serial killer on death row. That doesn't mean that you ought not to kill. That doesn't mean that you ought not kill him to prevent him from escaping and causing further harm. I have a lot of empathy for homosexuals in that I empathize, especially that I empathize with their plight. And we have actually another caller after complete rationality here, but there's no reason my intuition needs to line up with that. And go ahead, bring the caller in.
Well, I thought you're bringing the caller in. Is he not added to you yet?
He has not. Oh, I got him. Hold on, I just got him.
Okay. Okay, Epidemic, if you want to take the point before you do, maybe you can do so.
Say that again?
If you want to face a fight or say anything before we go. Oh,
No,
all right.
fine.
Okay. Everybody, this is complete personality. So we can go. So the restaurants are talking over.
Is it working now?
Yeah, it sounds okay. Complete rationality, what's your question, query, or the physical statement?
Wait, say that again. I'm still getting connected. I had to put my headphones on.
Okay, just what's your question, statement, or query?
I really don't have any yet. I just joined.
Okay.
We're talking about morality, so I was just wondering what your stance on that is.
What is my stance on morality? Well, for the most part, we can be sure that morality has something to do with the well-being of people, as Sam Harris would put it. That's about the only thing I assume on morality.
Excuse me, under atheism, not only do we know that it...
Whoa, buddy.
Can we have a bit of procedure? Can we let him finish? And if you want to talk, please.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
It's alright. If you want to talk, just type on Puppet Turtle. Come on, complete rationality, you finish your point, and then if Puppet Turtle wants to respond, he can do.
When something is considered morally wrong, it's usually dealing with harming another individual. Other than that, it's hard to place anything that's immoral on anyone. So I've yet to hear any argument, any cogent argument considering something immoral when it has nothing to do with the well-being of another person.
Okay, Puppet Turtle, the epidemic.
I would say...
Wait. I don't mean to interrupt. I just want to answer Olive to the Scott. Yes, I'm an advocate. Probably not in the sense that you think I am, but he is right that we can all agree that morality does have something to do with the well-being of other people. If you can't tell the difference between someone who's getting hit and the difference between someone who is healing a sick person in a hospital, then you're morally bankrupt, in my opinion. And I'm sure most other people around the world would agree with that statement. Usually when people don't agree with that statement, like William Lane Craig, he doesn't say it directly, but in the way he argues, he makes it seem as if he can't admit that point without being religious or something like that. But yeah, I agree with him that much on that. I wouldn't call it, I don't know whether it's objective. I don't believe morality is objective, but it's definitely above subjective. That's what I would say. It's not arbitrary, because we can actually measure whether someone is in a good condition or whether someone is in a bad condition.
Okay. Three things.
Okay, Puppet Turtle, the epidemic.
Three things to that. First, I mean, there is a thing. William Lane Craig may say this, but I certainly people who argue morality intelligently do not. They don't argue that. They don't argue that that you need a religion to recognize moral truth. Well, Craig may say that because he's a moron in some instances, while actually having good arguments in others. But I don't know of any people who I would consider to be arguing morality intelligently who say you need religion to recognize you need religion to recognize morality and apply it. What I would say is two things. One, to actually have certainty that those things that things such as murder are wrong. I would argue to have certainty about it, you need religion, and I would say in order to account for it, you absolutely need religion.
No, actually, religion offers no certainty because there are over thousands of religions. So where's the certainty in that? There's really no consistency. It's up to whatever religion is deciding what is moral and what is immoral. So
Religions make fact claims about reality, some of which are testable.
okay, then why is religion necessary? If it's testable, it's empirical. Therefore, a supernatural explanation is not needed.
No, that's not. No, not at all. And then I'll let Epidemic talk. You need the supernatural. You can test the aspect of the religion, such as in the event that someone has genuine repentance, there will be a change to their moral character, as is predicted by Christianity. You can sort of test that. But at the same time, you can test to see if that's true. You can also check to see if a good historical case can be made for the resurrection of Jesus. And if it can, that supports Christianity. If it can't, that brings it into very serious question. So by testing the naturalistic claims of a religion, you can get an idea indirectly of the true value of its supernaturalistic claims. And Epidemic wants to speak.
Yeah, Epidemic and then Aaron K, please.
I just wanted to touch on the claim about morality being related to well-being, because I completely agree. Morality is almost always correlated with well-being in some way. But I just want to make it also clear that that claim doesn't contradict any aspect of the moral argument whatsoever. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Like I said, I just came in. I got to ask the question, so.
Okay, okay.
All right, as previously noted, I don't have a lot of knowledge in this field, but I did hear, again, drawing from Veritas 48, and this seems to be a decently good argument. I'm not sure how to defend it, but basically it's arguing against the caller's stance that morality is always connected to the physical or emotional, I guess you could say, well-being of other people. And I would say Veritas 48 brought up this analogy. He said that would a bunch of pedophiles pulling up in their car to like an elementary school playground and just becoming aroused and gratifying themselves just by watching these innocent children. No one is being hurt, technically. No one is being, physically or emotionally degraded or anything like that. But I don't think that would exclude the possibility that is an immoral action to watch children in that way. So that's just something I heard.
I'm not exactly sure what your point was. Are you saying that that's one of the flaws of the well-being?
Yeah, I'm saying that this, at least the way I see it, would tend to refute the idea that immorality is always correlated with the well-being of another person. Because in that scenario, no one is technically being harmed, but many people would still consider that an immoral action. That's my point.
Oh, yeah. The Sam Harris explanation isn't a complete explanation of morality. It's just a very strong one that most people agree on. So.
Okay, Puppet Turtles and Epidemic.
I didn't realize I was next, so I don't remember asking to be next, so just let Epidemic know.
Yeah, I had this before. Was after Aaron K, so you were next. If you want to pass it on, it's Epidemic next.
Epidemic, I'll pass it to Epidemic.
Okay. Just going off of Aaron K's point here, I think that the pedophile example of the pedophiles in the park who are lusting after kids is an example of how not necessarily that well-being is irrelevant, but that maximizing well-being may not always be what is moral. Even if the pedophiles increased their pleasure and did not cause any decrease in pleasure.
Well, but there's a difference between, I hate to interrupt, but there's a difference between well-being and pleasure.
So there
Right.
are those.
Pleasure
Hold on.
would be a facet of well-being.
Yeah, but well-being stops at well-being. It's not necessary to go beyond that. We're talking about in terms of health, not in terms of desires or, things like that.
So here's an interesting thought. Why would we maximize the health as opposed to the happiness? What makes it that when we say something is morally good, that we should say health is morally good as opposed to saying pleasure is morally good? By what standard would you say one ought to be achieved rather than the other?
No particular standard.
I think that's ultimately the problem with Harris's view, is that it's not really prescriptive. He's giving a description. Harris explains how you can best achieve a specific goal. Whether that goal is health, there's a best way to achieve it. If it's pleasure, there's a best way to achieve it. If it's harm, there's a best way to achieve that. But at no point does he explain why goals ought to be achieved in the first place, especially when they compete with other goals.
Well, it's not necessary. I mean, he doesn't explain that what exactly morality is. He just gives a brief idea of morality as it relates to well-being, and it's pretty strong. I mean, the only people who seem to offer a complete explanation for morality, or who say that this is what is moral and this is what is not, would be religious people or people who are positing some supernatural explanation. Other than that, people don't attempt to pretend as if they know what makes something moral.
Yeah, I would say that the issue is, here's the thing. We know that the only explanation of morality that makes any damn sense is a supernaturalistic explanation. If you don't have the supernatural, you necessarily have ultimately moral nihilism, because you can never judge what goal is superior to what other goal. You can pragmatically...
Wait, sure you can judge. You can judge.
What possible thing can be intrinsic to my goal of increasing my sexual pleasure by raping somebody, as opposed to increasing that woman's pleasure by buying her a nice dinner for her? What is it? What goal? How can you judge which of those goals is better than the other? Ever, if you're not allowed to posit the supernatural.
You can judge by yourself, and you can judge by coming to a consensus with the other people that you live on the planet with. I mean, just because you judge, it doesn't automatically make it the law. I mean, you seem to be stuck on this idea that there is a such thing as objective morality. It's like asking the question, what is beautiful? Some people may think that this painting is beautiful. For example, the Mona Lisa, some people may not think it's beautiful. There's no such thing as objective beauty, and there's no such thing as objective morality.
Okay, then there's no sense in which morality has anything to do with there's no sense in which morality therefore has anything whatsoever to do with well-being, because it doesn't freaking exist.
Yes, it does, because well-being can be measured.
Yes, but if morality is
art.
subjective, then well-being can be measured, but you can't associate well-being with morality with any more strength than I can associate potatoes and their well-being with morality, or that I can associate my sexual pleasure with morality, or that I can associate my pleasure in eating a very, very, very tasty human sandwich.
Wait, why can we not associate well-being with morality?
I can do that, because I can say that I can.
Oh, okay. Well, without positing a supernatural explanation, why is it that we cannot associate well-being with morality?
Because if you only have naturalism, then the only thing, because all natural things are ises, and the is-ought gap prevents you from ever deriving an ought from an is. So since everything in a naturalistic universe is an is, everything in a naturalistic universe is morally neutral.
What makes you derive an ought from
Yes.
a God?
Go okay.
The desire to not go to hell, the desire to want to go to an afterlife.
No, the knowledge, the understanding that a God allows something to be intrinsically right, regardless of the
That's not an ought.
consequences.
That's not an ought. An ought would be something that obligates you to do something that compels you to do what is moral.
And a God that is a standard of morality that, regardless of the consequences, it does just that. In my opinion, Jacob Mango,
Jacob the epidemic.
Okay, I want to go back to the art analogy that one of you guys used. I don't think that's a good analogy, because if we're going to argue that morality is objective or subjective, that sort of implies there's some sort of measuring stick, and art by its very nature is a subjective based on the individual, and you don't really use a measuring stick to evaluate art. So to even use art to discuss morality is kind of a flawed analogy, because we're discussing well-being versus artistic value. So I'm not sure it's a good analogy.
Well, I had jumped off of the well-being and went to the broad sense of morality, because in general, it's no one really, well, a lot of people can agree, but when you have different religions that have different views on morality, a lot of things are seen as moral, and the same things can be seen as immoral. But one thing that is common that I would affirm that is more than subjective is well-being. But other than that, most things that people may consider immoral, like homosexuality, for some reason, that's immoral. All of these other things are immoral that have nothing to do with well-being. So, yeah.
Okay, academic.
All right, so I noticed you brought up the is-art gap really quickly, and I'm not going to kind of explain because it's a bit of a complicated issue, but the short answer to that is the way we have oughts is through our conscience. We just recognize that we ought not to do things like cause harm without good reason. And the problem with Harris's view is that it doesn't account for that aspect. When he talks about morality, he divorces it from that term ought. So if I was to make the claim, you ought not rape people for fun, Harris's view only explains that rape doesn't increase well-being. He doesn't account for anything beyond saying rape does not increase well-being. And the conscience tells us that you ought not rape people for fun, that that's a goal that I ought to adopt. Not just merely that it's a goal that has the best way to be achieved, but it's a goal that ought to be achieved. And given that, Harris's view doesn't account for what the moral argument is based upon. So you can actually accept both Harris's view and still accept the moral argument.
Are you guys I really don't have much to say to that. I think I understand what you're saying for the most part.
Yeah, perhaps I can simplify it a bit.
I mean, you know, the odds that I would say that Harris posits. The thing is, he's relying on the assumption that people would want to do good. The only thing that people use as an ought would be a supernatural explanation. If there's no ought, there shouldn't have to be some kind of ought that compels people to do things such as not rape a kid and then rape a kid. I think that's the best way I can put it. So he's relying on people to be rational, to be understanding, and to have feelings of empathy. So, which most people do have. So.
Okay, thank you, sorry. Puppet Turtle, sorry.
The problem with that is that you're right. He is accounting on people to use their moral sense to understand that the goals he's talking about is better, but he can't actually account for why it is intrinsically better. You're speaking as if me demanding that Sam Harris have a full account for the facts is an evil tactic to promote my evil supernaturalistic evil beliefs. That's not the case. I'm just demanding that he explain all of the observable data, coming to the conclusion that he's ultimately, in a way that comes to the conclusions that he's ultimately positing. And the conclusion that he's positing is that there is an objective morality, and the only way he can explain all the data under naturalism is to say that we innately desire certain things, and that there are best ways to achieve those goals. That doesn't actually explain objective morality, even if it accounts for the largest amount of data that naturalism possibly can. But what we're demanding is that especially if he wants to claim that there's objective morality and not be a moral nihilist, then he must explain how he can do that without a God, and that is intrinsically impossible.
He has explained how he can do it without a God.
No, he hasn't.
Yes, he has.
I think I can clarify this.
All right. Epidemic.
So what Harris shows, regardless of what he intends to show, what he actually shows is not accounting for the phrase, "you ought not rape people for fun." What he's explaining is that if you want to promote well-being, there's the most effective way to do that. And if you want to do it, then there's the most effective way to do that as well. And I agree, there is a most effective way to achieve whatever goal you have. But he's not accounting for why some goals ought to be achieved rather than others. So at the crux of it, he's explaining something that I completely agree with, and he thinks he's disproving the moral argument in this way, but he's actually not even touching on the same issues.
Okay, but you agree completely with the well-being aspect, right?
I agree completely that if well-being is your goal, that there's a best, most efficient way to achieve that.
So you don't agree that well-being should be pursued over harm?
Almost always, and well-being is almost 100% correlated with morality. Maximizing well-being, like utilitarianism, is not always moral. I think we can show that given a number of ways. But
if you have a group of kids being happy because they laugh at one of their friends, utilitarianism, that would be acceptable. Maximize the greatest number of people. So,
right.
Maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. That's what I meant.
It's hands.
Okay, Puppet Turtle.
How do you discern that is somehow an exception and that it's immoral for those kids to laugh at their friends? Sure, it causes harm to their friends, but it increases their pleasure, their collective pleasure more. And I mean, you could do what my friend Dick Mackey does. He, I think, makes the best attempt at deriving objective morality from deriving objective morality independent of God. And what he simply does is he defines the word morality and what moral behavior is. And in that way, there is a sense in which he makes it objective, but he doesn't make it meaningful. It's not true. It's not objective in the sense that we mean, in the sense that we sense it to be. But how do you determine what is moral, and how do you determine that exception exists?
You mean the example I gave with laughing at a friend?
Yes.
That was based on utilitarianism, the greatest happiness principle. If it maximizes happiness for the majority, then it is acceptable. So although it's wrong and is hurtful to that person who's being laughed at, the fact of the matter is that 3 people pitted against one person, those three people are getting pleasure and they're happy because they're laughing at that person. So that's why it fails with utilitarianism. I mean, it's acceptable within utilitarianism, but we know that that is not something that should be considered moral.
How?
Well, it's just, I don't know. Based on what most people agree with. There's no such thing as someone who is a complete arbiter of morality. It's about people coming together and, agreeing on things that are generally considered wrong.
Okay, Epidemic?
Let me ask you, do you consider it wrong? Or do you consider it acceptable?
Yes, I do, but the mic had just been passed on to Epidemic, so.
Okay, so you do consider it wrong. So it's called reasoning, and
yes, atheism can account for that, and atheism can't. Epidemic, take the mic, please, before he interrupts you again.
It's all good. Atheists and Christians should be able to come to some of the same moral conclusions. I think the problem with that Harris ultimately comes down to is that he's not saying what should be moral. He's picking a goal, calling that moral, and then telling us, all he's really telling us is the best way to achieve whatever goal we have. So there's a best way to achieve the goals of utilitarianism, there's a best way to achieve the goals of maximizing well-being, and there's even a best way to achieve the goals of just maximizing your own personal pleasure or personal well-being at the expense of others. But at no point is he accounting for what the moral argument talks about, which is that sense of ought, our conscience, the existence of objective morality, that we can know that some moral standards are better than others, that say utilitarianism is a better moral theory than Satanism. He's not accounting for that at all. He's just accounting for how goals have a most effective way to be achieved, which is entirely consistent with anything the moral argument says.
Well, the odds, there's no ought that's necessarily there. The only ought there is people who have good consciences, if that's a word, and who just would rather do good than do wrong. Who would rather that the well-being of others were maximized instead of the opposite. So
okay. So the problem I see with that is that you're saying, basically, you would take my phrase saying you ought not rape people for fun, and you would say you ought not rape people for fun if you value their well-being above your personal pleasure. And I don't think our conscience tells me that I ought not rape people, assuming that I value their well-being above my personal pleasure. But that regardless of what I value most, I still shouldn't rape that person. That's what my conscience tells me, and that's what we're trying to account for here.
Yeah. So
I think it's left unaccounted for in that view.
Yeah, it doesn't really hurt his argument, in my opinion, because most people do agree with that. If people want to be picky and attack him on the ought, then can you provide an example of where well-being, where his argument is flawed with well-being? I mean, if you would rather not maximize well-being of people, then, maybe you're just psychopathic. I'm not, talking to you directly, but, that's all I have to say.
Okay, so, oh shit, I just lost my train of thought.
I mean, anyone who has a sense of empathy,
All right, I got it back now. So the problem we're talking about here is that I'm focused on normative ethics. The whole moral argument is about accounting for the existence of normative ethics, and Sam Harris is not accounting for normative ethics at all. He's making claims about applied ethics, and as such, we can agree entirely with his claims about applied ethics, and the moral argument still be completely fine, because regardless of what he thinks what he's doing is explaining that there are right and wrong answers to how to best achieve goals, and the moral argument is about accounting for why some goals ought to be achieved. So we can accept all of his arguments and the moral argument still goes through unscathed. And in fact, I agree with most of what he says. I've been arguing that way for the past several years.
Okay, I mean, if you feel as if that there is a need for an ought, then, you know, there's not much I can say about that.
Do you think that the phrase, "you ought not rape people for fun," is true? Or is it only true if I value if I value your well-being above my personal pleasure?
Let's see, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. I would say that it's wrong to rape a person because it's not beneficial to their well-being. You're doing it without their consent. You're harming another person. You know, there's a lot wrong with that, but it does fall within the well-being argument.
So if I value my personal pleasure above someone else's well-being, ought I act in accordance with their well-being? Ought I go against what my personal desires are?
Yeah, well-being should be valued over pleasure.
Okay.
Right? We agree.
However, Hans.
Okay, probably so.
Okay, if that's it, how do you say under naturalism that the goal of well-being ought to be valued over the goal of my own personal sexual pleasure and or my genes and or all of the things that all of the things that we could say that all of the animals, that most of life on Earth, they all consider these things.
Easy. I can answer your question.
Let me finish. How could you say that how can you account for the fact that you just stated that my goal of bringing pleasure to others even more so than I bring to myself, or I'm sorry, maximizing the well-being of others. I realize there's a difference. I usually use those synonymously, but how can I say that for example, a rapist's goal of maximizing his sexual pleasure is somehow worse than my goal, and say that my goal is better under naturalism? Because you just claimed that the goal of maximizing well-being is better. How do you account for the fact that it is?
It's not about accounting. Again, it's just a matter of people coming together and agreeing on it. Let me give you a scenario. Which do you think is more moral, raping a kid or not raping a kid? I mean, I think you guys make some of this more complicated than it is with the well-being argument. But I mean, there's no way to make sure that anyone will do what is moral. The only things that promote that would be the laws that we have in place to prevent people from doing evil, and what people learn from society. So.
Okay, probably so.
Those would be the closest things we have to an ought.
So.
Yeah. I mean, you said it's not about accounting. To me, that's kind of like a creationist saying to me, it's not about accounting for the relevant scientific data. It's about making sure that your view is reconcilable with the scriptures. It feels to me like what you just said is as intellectually, what you just said, that it's not about accounting for the relevant. You just said that, to me at least, it's not about accounting for the relevant data about morality. It's about ensuring that my view is it's about accounting for as much of it as possible while ensuring that my view is reconcilable with metaphysical naturalism. No, to me,
whoa, I said nothing like that.
You must explain the relevant facts.
No, he doesn't.
Okay, state your point again.
You must explain the relevant facts. If you mean the same thing that I do by you ought to have this goal, and the thing I mean by that is that there is something intrinsically superior about this goal as opposed to any other. If you mean that saying you ought to have this goal.
Well, it wasn't an ought. It was more of a should. I don't know if the two are synonymous.
They are.
But it's really based on what most people agree to be wrong.
Okay, if everyone agreed that killing Jews was acceptable, would it become acceptable?
Within that time, but I'm not saying that it is acceptable, but to those people, yeah, if they all agreed, it would be acceptable, according to the majority thing.
And you just
talking about well-being.
Okay, so if we all agree that, so if everyone agreed that the goal, so what you're saying is, what you're saying is that the reason that this goal is better is because people tend to value it better.
Well, yes, I think that should be obvious.
I don't see how that actually really gives morality its...
Well, because there's no one who has yet to refute the idea of well-being. You know, who is going to say that getting hit is potentially better than not getting hit?
Okay.
I mean, there's a difference when the majority argument, you know, kind of comes in with this. There's a difference with this and then the Adolf Hitler thing.
Perfect.
Anyone can look at that and agree that it was wrong, but no one has yet to refute the well-being thing. Everyone has agreed on that, you know, maybe from the beginning of mankind, still up now.
Yeah. Okay, here's the thing. The well-being thing, you're right. Everyone has agreed on that for most of the time with mankind. And I would argue that though this is largely feigned in recent years, most of mankind for the longest time believed in geocentrism. I mean, even like when Dante's Inferno was written, that was based upon that the heaven section of that was based strongly on a heliocentric universe, and I'm aware of that, Jacob. Or based on a geocentric universe. So, I mean, no more than, it seems to me, if you're talking about morality as if it's a fact, as if it's an actual objective fact, and that's what you seem to be doing, then by arguing that it has anything to do with consensus, I could make an equally valid argument that geocentrism or heliocentrism or iocentrism or Hubble-centrism or Saturn-centrism has anything to do with the consensus. But like what? It has anything to do with the consensus.
Well,
let me finish, please. However, if you're arguing the way that your worldview of naturalism, if you're not a naturalist, I apologize, but if your worldview of metaphysical naturalism demands, you must say that though I have certain opinions that these things are right, ultimately I have to be honest and admit that there's nothing intrinsically right or wrong about them and be a moral nihilist. Those are your only two rationally defensible options.
No, I do not have to go to that position. You seem to have this idea that unless there is a true morality, or unless there's someone actually prescribing these values, that you cannot make a decision. No, that's absurd.
What's absurd about it?
Well, you can make a decision. You just don't have the right to tell anyone else objectively what is right and what is wrong.
But that's what I want. I want the ability to tell the rapist that he ought to stop raping people. We need that in order
you have the ability
to function.
You have the ability. It's just that you
I
guys may not have different values.
The only way you can tell somebody what they ought to be doing objectively is by invoking a God and a morality provided by such a thing.
No, invoking a God does not make anything objectively moral. So, if you want to have that argument, we can go there.
If the God has certain properties, then it does.
Okay.
Do I take a Jacob next, and then
Well,
if you also go up to that, put me till this beforehand.
Well, I kind of want to make a quick comment in regards to this. The question of whether or not morality is objective is separate from the question as to whether or not God is responsible for objective morality. Like, if you want to argue that God is the source of objective morality, that's a different argument as to whether or not morality is objective. You know what I'm saying? It was like
Are you talking?
I was talking to
Are you talking?
Puppy Turtle. My bad. Sorry, man.
Okay. That's cool.
Okay, put me till continue with that.
Would you repeat yourself?
But again, Piper Turtle, I just want to respond real fast. That's why I try to interrupt you because you respond for like a minute or two, and I can't really remember everything you said, but it's just come to my mind now. I never stated that. It seemed as if this is what you were saying, that well-being as it relates to morality is my worldview on morality. I wouldn't exactly say that. The only thing Sam Harris is arguing is that morality does have something to do with well-being. He's not completely accounting for morality.
Then he's not arguing against the theistic position at all. What he's saying is I agree with one of your observations. He's not doing what matters to me, which is accounting for the relevant.
Why does it matter to you? That's probably your first mistake.
Why should accounting for the relevant data matter to me? Well, I would say under your worldview of atheism,
it is not a worldview.
Let me finish. It is I would say under your worldview of atheism, it is equally morally neutral to value truth and what accounts for the relevant data as it is to value what makes you personally feel comfortable in a specific circumstances. Intellectual honesty is not a virtue under atheism, but for me, that's what I care about. That's what I care about.
That is your first mistake.
My mistake. My first.
You're asking for something that is not there, or you're assuming that if you ask for it, then you'll find it, or that it is there. I think the best thing to do is to try to reason the best you can.
I am reasoning the best I can, and that forces me.
What you're not reasoning. What you're doing is hoping that there's this you're just assuming that this explanation is there, so you look for it, and when you don't find it, you make it seem as if the other position is somehow wrong or invalid, or it can't help people be more moral.
I'm not saying it can't help people be more moral. What I'm saying.
Well, what I mean by that is the ought, the innateness in human beings to be kind to each other, or to have feelings of empathy.
That's irrelevant, and I kind of like we have Oliver Scott is waiting, and Aaron K says we have another caller besides him. So I do want to see if we can't fit both of those in and maybe make it a 3-hour show. I do want to see if we can't fit Oliver Scott into this show. So could you just make a closing statement, and then I'll go ahead and bring you out.
Okay, come on.
Let me see how far over time we need to run. It may not be a full hour.
Okay, cool. I thought this was a general discussion. I didn't know you guys were take callers.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wish I would have come earlier to hear everything, but I came in apparently an hour later. But I have nothing to add. I mean, if you guys have any questions, you can throw them at me.
This is actually an interesting topic in discussion.
Yeah, I mean, like. We might do this again. It seems like something that people are interested in. We may do this again. If you guys want to discuss this outside of here, that's fair enough. Right. Should we let Computer National go, or?
Yeah. I'm gonna let you get. Let's give him the last word, and then I'll drag in Oliver Scott.
I don't have anything to say. I mean, are there any arguments you're making against atheism?
No, we're just talking about morality right now.
This week, though.
All right, okay, let's bring in, this is Oliver.
Or
Hello.
hey, Oliver, what's your question, query, or statement?
I was just going to argue for moral nihilism. To go back to where we first came in, people were talking about a conscience, and we had innate abilities in us. I'd like to contest that. I don't think we all do have innate qualities of, say, empathy, knowing that it's wrong to hurt someone. It depends very much on being nurtured the right way. Any response, or would you like me to elaborate?
Do you want a bit over, or do you want epidemic?
Say me?
I said, Oliver, do you want to elaborate, or do you want epidemic to respond?
Okay, I would dispute that criminals, hardened criminals, would have a conscience. It would be trumped by a desire to vent their rage, and that depends on the background of the subject. I don't think it's a given that we're all going to have a conscience. More examples, maybe. The innate qualities in us vary from culture to culture. Like, I know some, even from person to person, you know, I know animal rights advocates who, you know, innately feel it's really wrong to eat something that was the product of death, while other people don't. So not everyone does have the same innate qualities. I mean, I will give you that many of us do in terms of not hurting someone or helping someone you see hurt in the street. Not everyone does. The fact that not everyone does means that it negates it being an objective truth.
Okay, epidemic, then over to El.
Okay, let me just clarify my view really quick. I'd argue that there's three aspects of morality, and the relevant one here is not empathy, but is intuition. The three categories, by the way, are going to be reason, intuition, and emotion. Reason tells us things like throwing sand in someone's face causes them harm. That's a conclusion I come to by use of experiencing the world. Intuition would tell me something like causing harm is wrong. And empathy is what typically gives me the incentives to act in accordance with my intuitions. It's not important, it's not necessary to have empathy in order to have moral intuitions. You brought up the example of the hardened criminal who is apathetic about morality. But we don't have to worry about, nothing about a person being apathetic proves that there is no innate knowledge of morality. And in fact, even if you find people who completely lack a moral sense, that's not going to disprove morality for the same reason finding blind people doesn't disprove my eyesight is real. It informs me of reality. And lastly, you brought up the argument from disagreement again, which we went over earlier. But you showed how people come to different conclusions about things like animal rights. And again, different moral conclusions is going to be something that falls under applied ethics and doesn't undermine normative ethics. If you want to undermine our intuitions and prove nihilism is true, then you need not to show that we come to different moral conclusions, but to show that we have different moral intuitions and that our moral intuitions can't be trusted. And I don't think you've done that quite yet.
Okay,
Right.
I would kind of add something to what Epidemic said and I would say that, you know, in the event that someone, you know, you could raise a person to be completely apathetic about morality. Like, I'm currently working on a sci-fi epic. One of the characters, I won't spoil it completely for you, one of the characters was, as a child, kidnapped by space pirates and made into a slave under the worst possible conditions, and he was only able to escape after only able to escape by very, very badly screwing over a loved one, and that's as far as I'll go. That kind of taught him the lesson that if you wanna do well in this galaxy, then the only way to do well is to screw other people over, because ultimately your pleasure, your well-being can only come at the expense of someone else. That's his philosophy that he's got from his experience, and so therefore he's become apathetic about morality. But I mean that you can raise someone and give them a background where they're apathetic about morality, but I don't see how you can take someone who was born with a working moral sense and make them truly not understand that they ought to do certain things and ought not do others.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, I'm not really well schooled on the philosophy of morality, so I'm not sure if I'm quite following your distinctions.
If I don't, okay, well, the distinction is this: okay, the distinction is this. In one case, we have the character who screws others over in order to do well, and he's apathetic about morality. He's perfectly aware that that's moral and that's not, but he doesn't really care. That kind of person, that's what you propose by saying that that's the kind of person that I think you can get with a certain type of nurture. The other type of person, in my opinion, with morality, you either have to be born blind or your sense organs, namely your brain, must suffer damage. And in both of those cases, it provides no challenge to objective morality. But I don't think upbringing has horrifically much to do with it, other than cultural misinformation. Beyond that.
I don't. So misinformation can kind of trump real information that would otherwise lead to someone being moral. Then I don't know how you'd make a distinction between what is right and what is wrong. You have an opinion, you have a contrary opinion.
Because some information is factually accurate and some information is wrong. Therefore, if there is a correct moral conclusion, then the correct moral conclusion is most likely going to be the one that is gotten from the correct information.
Okay,
So we spent quite a while talking about Sam Harris earlier, and this is the one part here is that Sam Harris directly addresses your question. He argues that let's say our intuition is to promote well-being. Well, regardless of what misinformation, let's say everybody has misinformation and nobody knows how to best maximize well-being, even though they all think they do. There is a right answer to that question. It's not just a matter of opinion. There is a best, most efficient way to produce well-being, even if a whole bunch of people are mistaken about what the best way is.
But the idea of spreading well-being in the first place, what is to say that is the right thing to do? There isn't, in my mind, a way of determining that that's a right thing to do in comparison to you gave an example of there is a right step in order to achieve this endeavor, and that's different from that it is right to promote well-being or whatever other thing you say is morally right.
Exactly. That's actually, you're taking the position we took earlier. But, yeah, that would be where ethical intuitionism comes in. The conscience is what tells us that we ought to achieve well-being in the first place.
Well, not everyone has a conscience, though. There's more of a conscience in some people than there are others.
Do you think that, let's say, my neighbor lacking a conscience proves that my conscience is wrong?
No, but I don't nor do I see it vice versa. To me, there are ways we can determine what is absolutely right and what is absolutely wrong. It comes down to, in the end, it's an opinion.
So would I be wrong to murder you?
In my opinion, yeah. I mean, I couldn't. If you said it was a good thing to murder me, I only really have opinion to go on. I try and reach you through human emotion ways, but sometimes it's the best of doing unless you're a psychopath. But I couldn't say, oh, what you're doing is objectively wrong. I have popularity on my side. I think I'd be in good company thinking that it's wrong to go and murder someone, but I wouldn't take the position that it's absolutely immoral to. And that's an absolute objective truth.
Okay, Puppet.
The problem with that position is that it denies me the very thing that I am seeking to do with morality, and that is the ability to tell somebody, regardless of their contentions to contrary, that what they're doing is factually immoral. Is factually and objectively immoral by Aaron K. That's the problem. That's the problem here. The thing that gives morality its power, the only reason I have any interest in morality is because I want the ability to tell to somebody, you are doing something that is, from a factual standpoint, objectively, morally wrong, and you provide no way to do that.
You don't need that, though. You can try and make a case without that, without saying it's absolute. That's just the way it is. It's not perfect. Not everyone agrees. I try and convince people it's wrong to eat meat and support an industry that treats animals rather cruelly. I can't get through to people. We have different values. They prioritize their values with their pleasure of eating meat over the welfare of a species they consider to be a lesser species. In fairness, it's less intelligent, but it still has the capacity to suffer. So it's very imperfect. I just can't reach people. That doesn't mean it's completely worthless. And I'd say the same thing about condemning murderers and trying to, to convince criminals that what they've done is wrong and try and reach them in that way to everyone else.
Epidemic 2020.
I think the important thing here that differentiates nihilism from my view, what should be the crux of the issue, is that when I say I have a conscience, and you respond by saying either that not everyone is conclusions or that not everyone has a conscience, neither one of those reasons have given me any reason to doubt that my conscience informs me of reality. So because my conscience tells me that there are certain things I ought to do, and that gives me reason to believe in objective morality until I have a reason to doubt the validity of my conscience. And neither one of those two reasons you presented give me that reason. So I would still be irrational for me to disbelieve in objective morality and simultaneously have that conscience.
Right, but what about, say, people in the Middle East who say they have a conscience to go and stone someone to death for offending their God?
Right, that's a moral conclusion. Right, and different moral conclusions don't disprove my conscience, because the conscience doesn't tell me that stoning the person is okay. The conscience just tells me broad things, like causing harm is wrong, generally wrong. What we disagree with the Middle Eastern person is that God commands me to stone that person, and that God's commands, that Allah's commands in this instance, are going to bring bad for mankind. I disagree on those two factual claims, and that's where my moral conclusion is going to differ. It isn't a differ of intuitions. It's a differ of information about reality, scientific information about reality.
I'm struggling to follow somewhat with the term conscience, but what you said at the last bit interests me. What do you mean by scientific?
I mean factual claims about reality. So, for
Right, and
example,
how can they tell you what's moral and immoral?
okay, so if somebody believes in reincarnation, then they're going to come to different moral conclusions than me. Except that claim that reincarnation is true is itself a claim which is true or false, and it's not based on my intuition. So that means that my moral conclusion is going to be skewed by my understanding of what is accurate about reality, factual aspects of reality that are that we should all be able to agree that are directly morally related. That makes sense?
No, sorry.
Okay.
Wait,
Cut out.
hold on. I think you should define what you mean by science first,
I just-
epidemic.
I just mean claims about reality that we can know are true or false. So if I was to say that if I believe throwing sand in your face would not cause you harm, then I would be factually wrong, and you would be able to show that using scientific methods.
I think we could scientifically say that I felt pain, but what is to say that that was wrong? That it could be a conclusion that it
Yeah, I think I
was
misspoke.
a good thing to harm me. Science can't say what is right or wrong about pain, or whether pain should be thought to be right or wrong. And
Right.
also, I might, to say it's harmful to me, is presumptuous. I might be masochistic. The pain might actually turn me on. It might be a good thing for me then to have
Okay.
sand thrown in my face.
So what I mean is that there are factual claims of whether or not throwing sand at you causes you pain, whether or not you're masochistic, whether or not reincarnation is true, whether or not Allah exists, whether or not He wants you to stone people, whether or not He actually produces what is good. Those are all scientific claims. And if I'm mistaken about any of those scientific claims, then and if we differ on those two factual claims about reality, then our moral conclusions will be different. But they're not going to be different because of differing moral intuitions. They're going to be differing about factual misinformation. And if you show that moral conclusions differ, that doesn't show that our intuitions are valid. That could be showing that we have different understanding about factual things about reality.
Maybe you could explain what intuition is again.
Intuition would be the knowledge that we're hardwired with about what we ought to do. Statements like,
I just completely disagree with that exists in all people. And you say that moral intuitions wouldn't be different. I think moral intuitions are different, if you want to call them that.
okay, you'd have to prove that, though, and then I would be rational for rejecting a belief in objective morality.
Well, there are people stoning people to death. Do you actually want to suggest that there's a moral intuition in them, telling them not to do that?
We just discussed that. That is a different moral conclusion. And the reason they differ is not because they think stoning people is fun to do, but because they have this mistaken belief that Allah exists, that Allah is good, and that Allah wants them to do that.
Okay, so
Yeah. Here's the thing. If you wanted to find somebody with a differing moral intuition, then you would need to actually find somebody that had identical beliefs absolutely identical beliefs about reality, and B, you would need to show that they came to the moral conclusion that something that you thought was morally obligatory, they thought you're morally obligated to avoid, or vice versa. Them thinking it's morally neutral does not count for me.
If I can focus on epidemic asking me to prove that we have different moral intuitions, these moral intuitions evidently can be trumped, because as you conceded, people are doing different things and considering that moral. So I don't see where the evidence is of the moral intuitions in themselves, because you have to say that these people doing things that we consider to be immoral or or trumping their moral intuitions. You're asking me to prove that there aren't moral intuitions. I don't see how you can prove to me that there are moral intuitions, in spite of the fact that people do different things and live by different moral codes.
Well, I mean, I personally have moral intuitions. That's right there. It's enough evidence for me to conclude that moral intuitions exist. But if you wanted more, then you can appeal to either history or evolutionary psychology. Have tons of works on how humans are literally hardwired, despite their environment, to have knowledge of what they perceive as an obligation to behave in a certain way of you. So we can see from literally science shows us that we have this conscience, and the presence of misinformation that leads us to differing moral conclusions doesn't in any way undermine any of that information.
Well, I disagree with that. I think we have inclinations towards, say, contact and holding other people and human contact, because, you know, in the womb we have a connection, and we tend to have, as I was saying, potential to be that way. But if a baby comes from out the womb and gets beaten, then they won't have that conscience. They'll have this, if they're beaten and abused until they're old enough to vent, they'll vent, and they'll just have this drive to vent their anger and abuse onto other people, and they won't have this conscience.
I think the disagreement here is that I'm not talking about tendencies or inclinations. I'm talking about knowledge of what's right and wrong. Not the, you don't have to grow up and actually obey your conscience in order to have one. You can be as a kid. If you're sexually abused or just mistreated, then you're going to vent as an adult. But the action that you do doesn't say anything about knowledge of what you ought to do. And it doesn't, not having knowledge of what you doesn't imply that you're going to care about that knowledge.
Well, what is to say that there is a knowledge that there's something we ought to do, that these people who do these bad things, what is to say that there is a knowledge they have that they're betraying?
What was that last part? Sorry.
What is to say that the people who do these things will be perceived as evil or wrong? What is to say that they have a knowledge of what they ought to do, that they are betraying?
It's something that happened for me to know that I have such knowledge, and I have no reason to think my knowledge is inaccurate.
Can you not see that other people don't have the knowledge? And I have these same sorts of feelings myself, but when I see people acting in certain ways, my conclusion is these people don't have what I have.
That's fine though. They don't have to have it. That's like us talking about, let's say you and me have eyesight, and then saying, well, I don't believe in stars, so I don't believe in stars anymore either, because he lacks eyesight. My personal eyesight gives me reason to believe stars exist because I can see them. My personal conscience gives me reason to believe moral facts exist. And the only way I can be rational doubting the existence of stars or moral facts is if I disprove either the validity of my own eyesight or the validity of my conscience, because they work using the same method. Does that at least make sense?
Somewhat. I mean, seeing stars, you're going to have there's going to be a far more unanimous opinion on stars existing than there is morality and what you ought to do. Well, I'm sure there are a few crazy people out there who do deny stars exist, but you'll find far more cohesion on that opinion as it exists than you will on what we ought to be doing.
That's an appeal to majority, I think.
Yeah, I do agree with what you said. I just don't think that point in particular undermines my claim.
a bit of stumbling block because, you know, hearing that initially when you talked about the star thing, it's you sort of, what's it called? Is it solipsism? You say something.
You broke up right there again. I'm sorry.
Solipsism, is it? Or
Oh.
something was a solipsis?
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've been dealt with. This is something I'll have to mull over. I don't really have anything more to say. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope to see you next time.
Yeah. Since Jacob is recording, we'll not end this show. Do you want a last word, Oliver, or should I just let you out?
Yeah, that's right. I had my last word, so I'll let you get on.
All right.
See you next.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
See you.
Okay, so Jacob is recording, and he said he'll BRB. So I mean, do you want to just say what the next show is about? Oh, yeah.
What's that show about?
The next show is just called Really Stupid Atheists, just talking about people like Calper and Pizzo, Thunderfoot, Yeez. The guest star is Deck Crash. The show is probably going to be Rant-tastic, and it's gonna be a lot of fun, and I hope everyone shows up. Bossman, I'm gonna give you a link to the outro. Bossman, do you want me to give you a link to the outro music?
I thought we were taking. I thought we were taking another call. You could have said.
Do we have another caller after Oliver Scott? Because
we have Minute Defend.
Okay, bring him in because he hasn't sent me a contact request.
All right, I'll bring him in.
I can't really play out my idea. Vida, is this okay?
All right, hold on. Hello.
How are you?
Oh wait, sorry, echo.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a little comment about an exchange on morale that I've been having with my friend. So he's a moral relativist, right? And he's been saying that he likes to cite the fact that morality has changed from century to century, from culture to culture. So the big one he cites is like slavery, and he says because slavery wasn't permissible back then and isn't now, that's evidence that morality has changed and therefore is relative based on time. But then I pressed him on it because I'm not a moral relativist, and I asked him if he thought slavery, if he thought it was wrong for the American slave owners to own slaves back then. Because if he did, then he's not really arguing for moral relativism. He's just he's actually arguing for moral objectivism, because he's appealing to a moral sensibility that transcends that time and that culture. Whereas if he was a real consistent moral relativist, then he would have just said that since it was acceptable back then it was acceptable back then, and now it's not acceptable. But the fact that he was saying it was wrong, for example, if you were to go on a time machine and go back then and see that there were slave owners, he would have thought that would have been yeah, it's just something that I wanted to bring up to you guys. See what you thought.
Okay, Epidemic.
That is pretty interesting. I think your approach actually works pretty well. I would probably added that it wasn't morality that changed, but the belief that black people are subhuman that changed. If you went back in time and then were able to convince the slaveholders that the people that they're mistreating are equivalent in all of the properties that they recognize as valuable, that they aren't actually subhuman, then I think you'd be able to convince them that slavery or taking advantage of them is not morally right.
Yeah, you got a good point there. But yeah, like, it's just a really bad example to cite because we're always morally outraged when we see injustice, no matter what time period and no matter what culture it occurs in. So to say that, but to argue for moral relativism is just being inconsistent. Like, he also said, like, I would say that it was wrong because my morality has improved. And I'm like, and I thought to myself, that's totally incoherent from a moral relativist standpoint. I mean, how can morality improve if you're speaking up, like, if you're a moral relativist, improved from what? Like, improved, like, to say that it improved in any way, just to, I don't know, appeal to some sort of transcendent truth about what morality ought to be like.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I don't think you can use the word improve if you're a relativist.
Yeah, that's all I really can say.
Anybody else want to talk?
I think
sorry, you go, Jacob.
I was going to say, I think what's been said has mostly been said so far, unless anyone else has wants to bring up another aspect of the topic.
Well, that's interesting. About morality, I don't usually use the word argument. I think it's a pointless argument. I just don't care why you does. Well, I mean, but I do think that it's important that you understand why.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I missed that. What did you say?
That's good about that I don't usually use the moral argument in our discussions, really. Like I said, that's a good thing.
That's all I had to say, so I guess I'll just get out of your way.
All right. Have a good one then.
Okay, so the next show is going to be on Stupid Atheist. Just being minor. Yeah, I think we are because I'm tired.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone else is tired.
I guess we're calling it.
Thank you,
I guess we're calling it a night then.
Yeah. Epidemic, are you going to come to the show? Anything in the comment section?
You say, am I going to come to the show?
Yeah.
Next week?
Yeah. Or is that
Yeah. I'll try and at least be observed.
Yeah, well, it's basically going to be on like Cal Priscilla and Thunderfoot.
Right.
Like that. Who else is a really stupid person? Yeah, stop recording, yeah.
All right. This is the end of the recording. So have a good one, guys.